Why does the soup taste like tears, Grace? Daniel's voice was cold, sharp, unfamiliar. Grace froze. What did you just say? I said, he pushed the bowl away, this marriage has been dead for years. Silencer then. Is there someone else? Grace asked. And with one word, yes. Everything shattered. He thought she would cry and beg. He thought she was weak. He forgot she built the empire he was standing on. This is not just a story about cheating. This is a story about power. About betrayal. About a woman who refused to die quietly. When love turns to salt, it doesn't just sting, it preserves revenge. If you love powerful emotional stories filled with betrayal, tragedy, and shocking twists, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Drop a comment. Would you forgive or fight back? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more explosive stories that will leave you speechless. Stay with me, because this one, it burns. Why does the soup taste like tears, Grace? Daniel dropped the spoon back into the bowl with a sharp clatter. The sound echoed against the marble walls of their dining room. Grace froze. Her fingers tightened around the serving spoon. What did you say? I said. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes cold and unreadable. This soup tastes like tears. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rattled the glass windows of their Lecky mansion. Inside, something far more dangerous was beginning to crack. Grace forced a soft laugh. You're being dramatic. It's your favorite, white soup with fresh catfish. I made it myself. That's the problem. His voice lowered. You made it yourself. Grace stared at him, confusion flashing across her face. Daniel, what is that supposed to mean? He pushed the bowl away. It means I'm tired. Tired of what? Tired of pretending. The words fell like stones. Grace slowly placed the spoon down. Pretending about what? Daniel stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the tiled floor. About this marriage. The air left Grace's lungs. What are you saying? She whispered. Daniel walked toward the bar, poured himself a glass of whiskey and drank it in one gulp. I'm saying this marriage has been dead for years. Grace's eyes filled with disbelief. Dead? Daniel, we built this house together. We built your company together. I was there when you had nothing. And I appreciate that. His tone was flat. But appreciation is not love. The room began to spin around Grace. 15 years. 15 years of standing beside him when investors rejected him. 15 years of sleepless nights helping him calculate business projections. 15 years of miscarriages and silent prayers. Now this? Is there someone else? Grace asked, her voice trembling but steady enough. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That silence was louder than any confession. Grace's heart shattered quietly inside her chest. Daniel, she repeated, firmer this time. Is there someone else? He exhaled slowly. Yes. The words sliced through her. Her knees nearly gave way, but she held the table for support. Who is she? You don't know her. That's not what I asked. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Her name is Vanessa. Grace swallowed hard. How long? A year. A year. A whole year of lies. Grace remembered the late meetings, the sudden business trips, the phone that was always face down, the way he started wearing new cologne. Salt. That's what she tasted in her mouth. Salt. Not from tears, from betrayal. Does she know you're married? Grace asked. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Of course she knows. And she's okay with that? She understands me. Grace's lips trembled. Understands you? Yes. She doesn't question me. She doesn't nag. She doesn't remind me of failures. Grace stared at him like she had never seen him before. Failures? She whispered. You mean the miscarriages, the doctor's reports, the nights I cried alone because I couldn't give you a child? Daniel's jaw tightened. I never blamed you for that. You didn't have to, Grace replied softly. Your silence did. Daniel turned away. I want a divorce. The words landed heavy. Grace felt something inside her die completely. A divorce, she repeated slowly. Yes. And Vanessa? I plan to marry her. The audacity, the cruelty, the betrayal. Grace nodded slowly, her face suddenly calm in a way that frightened even Daniel. I see. You're not going to fight me? He asked, suspicious. Grace walked toward him until they were inches apart. For what? She said quietly. A man who already left? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Grace picked up the bowl of soup from the table and walked to the sink. She poured it out slowly, white soup swirling down the drain. 15 years washing away. She turned back to him. You said it tastes like tears. Daniel remained silent. You're right, she continued. It does. She wiped her hands with a towel. But be careful, Daniel. His eyes narrowed. Careful of what? Grace's voice dropped into something colder, stronger. Salt preserves things. A faint smile curved her lips, and betrayal has a way of preserving consequences. Daniel laughed dismissively. Is that a threat? No, she said calmly. It's a promise. He grabbed his car keys. I'll have my lawyer contact you. Grace didn't move. Good night, Daniel. The door slammed behind him. Grace stood alone in the massive house. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. She walked slowly upstairs into Daniel's home office, a room he believed she never entered. She opened the drawer of his desk. Inside were documents, shares, property deeds, investment accounts, all in his name, or so he thought. Grace opened her own laptop. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. You see, before Daniel became the face of his empire, Grace was the silent architect. She knew every loophole, every hidden clause, every secret account, and Daniel had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the woman who built him. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of weakness, of awakening. If you want war, she whispered to the empty room, I will season it properly. The next morning, Grace woke before sunrise, not because she slept well, but because pain does not allow rest. The other side of the bed was empty, cold, untouched, 15 years reduced to an empty pillow. Grace sat up slowly and stared at her reflection in the large bedroom mirror. Her eyes were swollen, but there was something else there now, clarity. She whispered to herself, crying ends today. Across town, in a luxury apartment overlooking the Atlantic, Vanessa stood in front of her wardrobe. Do you think she cried? Vanessa asked, adjusting her silk robe. Daniel, seated on the edge of the bed, smirked. Of course she cried. Vanessa smiled slowly. Good. Daniel looked up at her. You don't feel guilty? Vanessa turned, walking toward him gracefully. She ran her manicured fingers down his chest. Guilty for loving a man who deserves happiness? She asked softly. Daniel pulled her closer. You're different from her. Vanessa's lips curved. I know. But what Vanessa didn't know was this. Grace was not the helpless wife she imagined, and Daniel was not as powerful as he believed. Later that afternoon, Grace sat across from a man named Barrister Kunle Adeyemi, a sharp, quiet man in his late 50s. He had handled corporate wars that destroyed families. He listened without interrupting as Grace laid everything out. The affair, the divorce, the business. Kunle folded his hands calmly. Mrs. Okafor, he began carefully. Are you aware that 60% of Daniel Okafor's company's shares are legally tied to your initial investment trust? Grace nodded slowly. I structured it that way. Kunle raised a brow. Does he know? No, a small silence followed. Then, Kunle said carefully, if he files for divorce without negotiation, he could lose almost everything. Grace's expression didn't change. Not almost, she corrected. Everything. That evening, Daniel hosted a private dinner at a 5-star hotel. Vanessa sat beside him, glowing in gold silk. Investors laughed around the table, glasses clinked, deals were discussed. Vanessa leaned closer. When will you tell them about us? Daniel smiled. Soon. After the divorce? Yes. She kissed his cheek, softly. Across the room, one of Daniel's senior partners, Mr. Ibrahim, watched them closely. He noticed something Daniel didn't. Vanessa wasn't just affectionate, she was calculating. Meanwhile, Grace was in their mansion, packing nothing. Instead, she was gathering evidence, emails forwarded to her private archive, financial transfers, luxury purchases, gifts Daniel had bought for Vanessa using company funds. She opened a folder labeled SALT. Inside were scanned documents, audio recordings, screenshots. Daniel thought he was careful, but betrayal always leaves fingerprints. 3 days later, Daniel walked into the house with Vanessa. Yes, this is it, he said confidently. Vanessa's heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped inside. This is beautiful, she whispered. Grace stood at the top of the staircase. Calm, composed, wearing white. Vanessa's smile faded slightly. Daniel stiffened. Grace, you didn't tell me we were having guests, Grace replied evenly. Vanessa stepped forward confidently. I'm Vanessa. Grace looked her up and down slowly. So you're the silk, she said quietly. Excuse me? Vanessa frowned. Nothing. Grace smiled faintly. Welcome to my home. Daniel's jaw tightened. Grace, we talked about this. Yes, Grace nodded. You want a divorce? Vanessa crossed her arms. Then why are you still here? Grace turned her gaze to her. Because I own it. Silence. Daniel laughed awkwardly. Grace, stop this. She walked down the stairs slowly, each step controlled. Daniel, she said calmly, you may want to check the ownership documents before bringing strangers into properties that legally belong to me. Vanessa looked at Daniel sharply. What is she talking about? Daniel frowned. Grace, don't play games. Games? Grace tilted her head slightly. No, I'm simply informing you. She walked past them toward the door. Oh, and Daniel? He turned. Your lawyer should have received something this morning. Daniel's phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Email notification from his lawyer. Subject, urgent, asset review. His face changed as he opened it. What is it? Vanessa demanded. Daniel's breathing grew heavier. This can't be right. Grace opened the front door. Salt, she said softly without turning back, always reveals what was hidden. The door closed behind her. Vanessa stared at Daniel. What is happening? Daniel looked at her slowly. For the first time since he left Grace, he wasn't in control. This is impossible, Daniel muttered, staring at his phone as if the words would rearrange themselves. Vanessa grabbed the device from him. What does it say? Daniel's voice was tight. It says the house, the company headquarters, the Ikoyi duplex, are all under a marital investment trust. Vanessa frowned. So? So, he snapped. The primary beneficiary is Grace. The air shifted. Vanessa's confidence flickered for a second. But you're the CEO. Yes. And the founder. Yes. Then how? Because? Daniel cut in bitterly. When I started, I had nothing. The memory hit him like a slap. Grace sitting beside him in a small one-room apartment. Grace selling her late mother's land. Grace convincing her uncle to release the inheritance early. Grace transferring the first 40 million naira that became the seed of everything. He had signed papers back then without reading carefully. He trusted her, and she had structured everything intelligently. Vanessa's heels clicked as she paced. So what does this mean? It means, Daniel said slowly, if she fights, I could lose controlling shares. Vanessa stopped pacing. And me? She asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer. That night, Grace sat alone on the balcony of the mansion. The ocean breeze brushed against her face. She wasn't smiling. Revenge wasn't sweet yet. It was heavy. Pain still sat in her chest like a stone. Her phone rang. Barrister Kunla. Yes? They've reviewed the documents, he said calmly. Daniel's lawyer is requesting a meeting. Grace looked at the dark horizon. Good. Are you certain you want to escalate this? He brought his mistress into my house, Grace replied evenly. Escalation began there. Kunli sighed softly. Very well. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The next morning, tension filled the conference room. Daniel walked in with his lawyer, Mr. Adewale. Grace was already seated, elegant, calm, dressed in deep blue. Daniel avoided her eyes. Adewale cleared his throat. Mrs. Okafor, there seems to be a misunderstanding regarding asset control. Grace folded her hands. There is no misunderstanding. A file slid across the table, stamped, signed, legally binding. Daniel's jaw tightened as he skimmed through it. Why didn't you ever tell me? He demanded. Grace looked at him steadily. You never asked. Silence. You knew? He pressed. Yes. You planned this? No, she replied softly. I protected myself. Vanessa sat in Daniel's car outside the office building. She watched the entrance impatiently. When Daniel finally emerged an hour later, his expression was darker than she had ever seen. Well? She asked. He entered the car without answering. Daniel, she can remove me as CEO. Vanessa's heart skipped. What? She owns majority voting power through the trust. If she calls the board... Vanessa's voice sharpened. Then stop her. Daniel looked at her slowly. It's not that simple. Vanessa stared ahead, her thoughts racing. She didn't fall in love with Daniel when he was struggling. She met him at a business gala. She admired power, security, influence. If that collapsed, her eyes hardened. 2 days later, Grace made her move. The board meeting was called unexpectedly. Daniel sat at the head of the long table, unaware of what was about to unfold. Board members whispered among themselves. Grace entered, not as a wife, as a majority stakeholder. Mr. Ibrahim nodded respectfully at her. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Grace stood calmly. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, voice steady, recent financial audits have revealed misuse of company funds. Daniel's head snapped toward her. What are you doing? He hissed. Grace didn't look at him. Luxury gifts, private trips, unauthorized withdrawals. A screen lit up behind her. Transactions, dates, evidence. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly. The room grew quiet. Mr. Ibrahim leaned forward. Mr. Okafor, care to explain? Daniel's throat went dry. They were personal expenses. Paid from company accounts, Grace finished. Murmurs filled the room. This is sabotage, Daniel growled. No, Grace said calmly. This is accountability. She looked directly at the board. As majority shareholder, I propose a temporary suspension of Daniel Okafor as CEO pending investigation. The words dropped like thunder. Daniel shot to his feet. You can't do this. Grace finally met his eyes. You said our marriage was dead, she said quietly. But the business? Her gaze hardened. That is very much alive. Hands slowly raised around the table, one by one. Votes cast. Daniel watched his empire slip through his fingers in real time. The final vote was unanimous. Suspension approved. Outside, Vanessa's phone buzzed with notifications, news alerts. CEO of Okafor Group suspended amid financial probe. Her face drained of color. Daniel exited the building like a man walking to his execution. Reporters already gathered. Flashes. Microphones. Mr. Okafor, is it true your wife exposed financial misconduct? He said nothing. He couldn't. Inside the building, Grace remained seated. Alone now. The board members gone. She exhaled slowly. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Not from weakness, but from the weight of it all. 15 years. Destroyed, and now? War. Vanessa stood by the roadside as Daniel approached her. Well? She demanded. He looked at her like a stranger. It's over. Vanessa shook her head. No, we'll fix it. Daniel laughed hollowly. She didn't just fight back, he said quietly. She salted the wound. You need to fix this. Vanessa's voice was sharp, no longer soft like silk, now edged like broken glass. They were back in her luxury apartment, the one Daniel had paid for. Daniel stood by the window, staring down at the city that once bowed to him. I can't just fix a board suspension, he replied coldly. Vanessa crossed her arms. Then fight her. I did, he snapped. You saw what happened. No, Vanessa said slowly, stepping closer. You underestimated her. The words hit harder than she intended. Daniel turned. Be careful. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Careful, I left everything for you. Daniel laughed bitterly. You didn't leave anything. You upgraded. The silence that followed was dangerous. Meanwhile, Grace sat inside her now quiet mansion. Reporters had already started spinning the story. Power wife takes down husband. Corporate betrayal at Okafor Group. But the public didn't know the full story. Not yet. Her phone rang. Mr. Ibrahim. Mrs. Okafor, he said respectfully, there's something you should know. I'm listening. Daniel has been trying to reach some board members privately. Grace's expression didn't change. He's desperate. Yes. Let him try, she replied calmly. Desperation reveals character. 3 days later, Vanessa walked into a boutique in Victoria Island. She wore oversized sunglasses, pretending the whispers didn't follow her. 2 women near the counter murmured loudly enough. Isn't that her? The mistress? Vanessa's jaw tightened. She picked up her phone and called Daniel. They're talking about me everywhere. That's what scandals do, he replied flatly. You said you'd protect me. I'm trying to protect myself. The line went silent. That was the moment Vanessa realized something terrifying. Daniel was no longer fighting for love. He was fighting for survival. And in survival mode, people abandon baggage. That evening, Daniel showed up at the mansion. Grace wasn't surprised. She was expecting him. He walked in slower this time, less confident. This doesn't have to be war, he began. Grace sat calmly in the living room, sipping tea. You brought war into my home, she replied. I was emotional. You were arrogant. Daniel clenched his jaw. I made mistakes. You made choices. Silence. He stepped closer. Withdraw the suspension. No. Grace, you wanted freedom, she said softly. Now you have it. Daniel's voice dropped. You're enjoying this. Grace looked at him carefully. No, she said truthfully. I'm surviving it. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. The next blow came unexpectedly. Vanessa's bank card was declined at a restaurant. She tried again. Declined. Her apartment access card stopped working that night. Panicked, she called Daniel repeatedly. Finally, he answered. What did you do? She demanded. I froze unnecessary expenses. Unnecessary? I live there. For now. The coldness in his voice stunned her. You said you loved me. Daniel was quiet. Then, I loved how you made me feel. Her heart dropped. That's not the same thing, he added. The call ended. Vanessa stood outside the building, humiliated. The security guard avoided her eyes. Silk had torn. Back at Okafor Group headquarters, Grace continued restructuring. Audits uncovered more irregularities. Daniel had been careless. Love makes people reckless. Or maybe ego does. She called Barrister Kunle. If he pushes further, she said calmly, file the motion to remove him permanently. Are you certain? Kunle asked. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Yes. The removal hearing was swift, evidence mounted, board trust broken, investors nervous. Daniel sat in the same chair he once ruled from, but this time he wasn't leading, he was defending. The vote passed. Permanent removal as CEO. He remained a minority shareholder, power stripped. Control gone, empire fractured, outside rain poured heavily. Daniel stood alone under the building canopy. No reporters now. Scandals lose glamour when power disappears. His phone buzzed, a message from Vanessa. "We need to talk." He stared at it. For the first time, he didn't feel desire, only exhaustion. Across town, Grace stood by her balcony again, watching the same rain, but tonight something was different. She wasn't shaking, she wasn't crying, she was rebuilding, slowly, carefully, intelligently, but deep inside her heart, the pain still lived, because revenge doesn't erase betrayal, it only balances it. And somewhere in the city, Vanessa was realizing a painful truth. She hadn't stolen a king, had borrowed a man standing on borrowed power, and now the salt was burning everyone. "I sacrificed everything for you." Vanessa's voice trembled as Daniel stepped into the small cafe where she had asked to meet. It was no longer five-star hotels, no private lounges, just a quiet corner table and curious eyes. Daniel removed his sunglasses slowly. "Don't start. Don't start," she repeated, disbelief flooding her face. "You froze my accounts. I had to move my things out like a criminal." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You were never supposed to depend on me." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "That's funny because you told me to quit my job." Silence. "You said," she continued, mimicking his voice, "I'll take care of you." Daniel's jaw tightened. Things changed. "No," Vanessa whispered. "Grace changed them." Across town, Grace sat in her late father's old study, a room she hadn't entered in years. She opened a wooden box filled with letters. One from her father stood out. "My daughter, never build a man without building yourself stronger." Tears filled her eyes. She had built Daniel, but she had also built herself, and that was the difference. Her phone buzzed. Mr. Ibrahim again. "There's pressure from some investors," he said carefully. "They fear instability." Grace nodded. "Then we stabilize it. You're certain you want to remain visible in leadership?" Her voice became firm. "I'm not hiding anymore." Daniel returned to the mansion that night, not to beg, not to shout, but because he had nowhere else that felt familiar. Grace found him sitting alone in the living room. "You still have access?" she asked calmly. "I still have keys," he replied. "For now." He looked up at her. "You've won." Grace shook her head slightly. "This was never a game." Daniel studied her face. "You've changed." "No," she said quietly. "I've awakened." He laughed hollowly. "You're colder." Grace's voice softened, but not in weakness. "You mistook my loyalty for dependence." That truth settled heavily between them. Meanwhile, Vanessa packed the last of her belongings into 2 suitcases. The luxury dresses, the gold heels, the silk robes, all symbols of a life that evaporated in weeks. Her phone rang. It was a journalist. "Miss Vanessa, would you like to comment on the scandal?" She hesitated. Revenge whispered in her ear. If she spoke publicly, she could damage Daniel further. But damage him into what? He was already falling. And if he sank completely, what would she gain? Nothing. Because she had tied her future to his power, and his power was gone. She hung up. For the first time, Vanessa felt fear not of Grace, but of her own miscalculation. 2 weeks later, the divorce hearing began. The courtroom was quiet but tense. Daniel looked worn. Grace looked composed. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. Asset division, trust ownership, misuse of company funds, breach of marital fidelity. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue reconciliation. Grace's lawyer shut it down with evidence. Clear, precise, final. When the judge granted the divorce, the sound of the gavel echoed like a door slamming shut on 15 years. Grace exhaled slowly. Daniel stared ahead. He had wanted freedom, but freedom felt heavier than marriage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mrs. Okafor, any statement?" Grace paused briefly. "Yes." Microphones lifted. She looked directly into the cameras. "Betrayal doesn't destroy you," she said calmly. "It reveals who you truly are." She walked away without another word. That clip went viral within hours. That night, Daniel sat alone in a smaller apartment. No staff, no grand staircase, no empire. His phone showed missed calls. Vanessa, investors, friends who now kept distance. He poured himself a drink. The silence was loud. For the first time, he replayed everything without ego. Grace supporting him, Grace believing in him. If Grace warning him quietly, he whispered into the empty room, "I was a fool, But regret is a language spoken too late. In the mansion now solely Grace's, she stood before the large mirror again, the same mirror from the night everything began. Her eyes were no longer swollen, they were steady, strong, but still human. She touched her reflection lightly. "I survived you," she whispered. Yet deep down, this wasn't over, because empires fall loudly, but wounded pride, that falls silently. And somewhere in the darkness of his reduced world, Daniel was beginning to feel something dangerous. Not love, not regret, but resentment. The kind that brews quietly, the kind that waits. And when pride mixes with humiliation, salt can turn into poison. Part 5. I sacrificed everything for you. Vanessa's voice trembled as Daniel stepped into the small cafe where she had asked to meet. It was no longer five-star hotels, no private lounges, just a quiet corner table and curious eyes. Daniel removed his sunglasses slowly. "Don't start. Don't start," she repeated, disbelief flooding her face. "You froze my accounts. I had to move my things out like a criminal." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You were never supposed to depend on me." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "That's funny, because you told me to quit my job." Silence. "You said," she continued, mimicking his voice, "I'll take care of you." Daniel's jaw tightened. Things changed. "No," Vanessa whispered. She tried again, declined. Her apartment access card stopped working that night. Panicked, she called Daniel repeatedly. Finally, he answered. "What did you do?" she demanded. "I froze unnecessary expenses." "Unnecessary? I live there. For now." The coldness in his voice stunned her. "You said you loved me." Daniel was quiet. Then, "I loved how you made me feel." Her heart dropped. "That's not the same thing," he added. The call ended. Vanessa stood outside the building, humiliated. The security guard avoided her eyes. Silk had torn. Back at Okafor Group headquarters, Grace continued restructuring. Audits uncovered more irregularities. Daniel had been careless. Love makes people reckless. Or maybe ego does. She called Barrister Cunley. "If he pushes further," she said calmly, "file the motion to remove him permanently." "Are you certain?" Cunley asked. Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." The removal hearing was swift. Evidence mounted, board trust broken, the investors nervous. Daniel sat in the same chair he once ruled from. But this time, he wasn't leading. He was defending. The vote passed. Permanent removal as CEO. He remained a minority shareholder. Power stripped. Of control gone. Empire fractured. Outside, rain poured heavily. Daniel stood alone under the building canopy. No reporters now. Scandals lose glamour when power disappears. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "We need to talk." He stared at it. For the first time, he didn't feel desire, only exhaustion. Across town, Grace stood by her balcony again, watching the same rain. But tonight, something was different. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was rebuilding. Slowly, carefully, intelligently. But deep inside her heart, the pain still lived. Because revenge doesn't erase betrayal. It only balances it. And somewhere in the city, Vanessa was realizing a painful truth. She hadn't stolen a king. She had borrowed a man standing on borrowed power. And now the salt was burning everyone. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. Slow, deliberate. Grace was in the library, reviewing quarterly reports when the sound echoed through the mansion. She didn't panic. She already knew who it was. Daniel never knew when to let things end quietly. She walked to the door and opened it. He stood there, rain-soaked, eyes tired, pride barely stitched together. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly. "I had nowhere else to go. That stopped being my responsibility." He swallowed. "Please." Grace studied him carefully. The man who once commanded boardrooms now looked like a shadow of himself. "What do you want, Daniel?" He stepped inside without waiting for permission. "I need your help." The audacity. Grace closed the door slowly. "You lost the right to ask me for anything. They're investigating me." Her expression didn't change. "I know." His head snapped up. "You know?" "I'm still majority shareholder," she replied evenly. "When regulators start sniffing around, I hear about it first." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "They're considering fraud charges." Silence filled the room. Grace's voice lowered slightly. "Did you commit fraud?" Daniel hesitated. That hesitation said everything. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "I moved money around to cover losses. I was going to replace it." "With what?" she asked sharply. "Hope?" He flinched. Across town, Vanessa sat in a modest apartment she had rented with her remaining savings. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Authorities expand investigation into Okafor Group financial irregularities. Her breathing quickened. If Daniel went down publicly, her name would resurface. Her reputation already bruised would shatter completely. She opened her gallery. Photos of vacations, jewelry, private jets, evidence of a lifestyle funded by questionable transfers. A dangerous thought crossed her mind. What if she protected herself first? Back at the mansion, Daniel paced like a trapped animal. "You can stop this," he said. Grace stared at him. "No, I can't. You have influence. I have integrity." His frustration exploded. "Don't act holy. You destroyed me." Grace's eyes flashed for the first time. "No, Daniel. I exposed you." "That's the same thing." "No," she said coldly. "Destruction is when someone innocent is harmed. Exposure is when someone guilty is revealed." He fell silent. The truth burned. Suddenly, Grace's phone rang. Barrister Kunle. She answered calmly. "Yes?" His voice was serious. "We have a problem." Daniel stiffened. "What kind of problem?" Grace asked. "One of the external accounts used for transfers traces back to a joint authorization." Grace's heart skipped once. "Explain." "Years ago," Kunle continued carefully, "when you both restructured emergency liquidity access, your digital signature remained linked." Grace went still. Daniel stared at her. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. Grace's voice tightened. "It means, technically, I could be implicated." Silence swallowed the room whole. The salt had shifted direction. Daniel looked at her with something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, not resentment. Fear. "They'll drag you into this," he said softly. Grace's mind raced. She had protected herself from emotional betrayal, but corporate entanglement, that was more complex. Kunle's voice came through the phone again. "We can fight it, but it won't be clean." Grace ended the call slowly. Daniel spoke first. "I never meant for you to be involved." She looked at him sharply. "You never meant for anything to collapse. Yet here we are." Meanwhile, Vanessa made a decision. She contacted a journalist privately. "I have information," she said carefully, "but I want protection." The journalist's interest sharpened instantly. "What kind of information?" "Financial transfers," she replied. "Private communications." She wasn't doing this for revenge. She was doing it for survival. If Daniel sank, she would not drown with him. The next morning, headlines exploded. New witness emerges in Okafor financial scandal. Daniel's phone vibrated endlessly. Grace stood by the television, watching the news unfold. A blurred silhouette appeared on screen. Vanessa's voice, disguised but recognizable. Funds were frequently moved to cover personal expenses, luxury apartments, gifts. Daniel's face drained of color. "She's turning on me." Grace didn't look surprised. "People who enter through betrayal," she said quietly, "rarely exit with loyalty." Daniel sank into the couch. For the first time since this began, he looked truly broken. Not powerful, not angry, just human and terrified. Grace felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Not love, not revenge, but conflict. If Daniel went to prison, her name could be dragged through courts for years. Her company could suffer. Her reputation could bleed. The past was refusing to die quietly. And the salt, it was no longer just burning. It was spreading. Daniel looked up at her weakly. "What do we do?" Grace stared at the man who once shattered her heart and realized something terrifying. Their war had created a bigger enemy. Consequences. And consequences do not choose sides. What do we do? Daniel's voice was no longer commanding. It was pleading. Grace stood by the window, watching the early morning traffic move like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. She turned slowly. "We don't panic," she said calmly. Daniel gave a hollow laugh. "That's your solution?" "It's the first step to survival." He rubbed his face. "Vanessa is giving them information. If she hands over documents..." "She will," Grace interrupted. He looked at her sharply. "You're very certain." Grace's eyes were steady. "A woman who attached herself to power will detach when that power collapses." Silence. Daniel whispered, "I never thought she would betray me." Grace's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but irony. "Now you know how it feels." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried weight. Later that afternoon, Grace and Daniel sat across from Barrister Kunle in his office. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Kunle adjusted his glasses. "The situation is complicated, but not hopeless," he began. "Define not hopeless," Daniel muttered. "It means," Kunle continued calmly, "we create distance between Mrs. Okafor and any questionable transfers. We prove lack of active authorization." "And me?" Daniel asked quietly. Kunle looked at him directly. "You prepare for consequences." Daniel swallowed. Grace watched him carefully. This was the man who once walked into boardrooms with effortless authority. Now he sat like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The shift was brutal. Across town, Vanessa sat in a private meeting with investigators. Her hands were steady, her voice controlled. "Yes," she said, sliding printed documents across the table. These were payments made directly from corporate accounts. "Were you aware they were unauthorized?" one officer asked. She hesitated. "I assumed he had control." That answer was intentional. It shifted responsibility without making her look complicit. Smart. Very smart. But betrayal always leaves residue. That evening, Daniel returned to the mansion again, not as a husband, not as a leader, but as a man cornered. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly. Grace paused. She was pouring herself water. "I'm helping myself. That's not what I mean." She faced him. "If you fall publicly, the company shakes. If the company shakes, employees suffer. Investors panic. My name stays tied to yours. So this is business? It has to be." Daniel studied her. "And personally?" Grace held his gaze. "Personally," she said quietly, "I already buried us." Those words hurt more than any scream. Days passed, investigations deepened, media intensified, Vanessa's identity eventually leaked, public sympathy turned harsh, social media was ruthless, gold digger, homebreaker, opportunist. She stayed indoors, but insults find their way through walls. One evening, she stared at herself in the mirror. "You survived," she whispered. But did she? She had money frozen, reputation damaged, future uncertain. She had gambled on power, and power collapsed. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening inside Grace. The anger that fueled her started cooling, not into forgiveness, but into clarity. One night, she sat across from Daniel in the quiet living room. "You need to tell the truth," she said. "I'll go to prison." "Not if we negotiate properly." Daniel looked confused. "Why would you negotiate for me?" Grace exhaled slowly. "Because I refuse to let your mistakes become my cage." Silence. "For years," she continued, "I built something meaningful. I will not allow scandal to define me." Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Grace wasn't fighting him anymore. She was protecting her future. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, a settlement offer. Daniel would admit to financial mismanagement, pay heavy penalties, resign permanently from executive influence, avoid prison through structured restitution. It was humiliating, public, painful, but survivable. Daniel signed the papers with shaking hands. Grace signed hers too, removing her name from any outdated joint authorizations permanently. Clean separation, at last. When the press conference was held, Daniel stood at the podium alone. Cameras flashed. "I made serious professional errors," he said into the microphone, "and I take full responsibility." Grace watched from home. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel sorrow. She felt closure beginning. That night, Daniel returned the final key to the mansion. He held it out to her. "This is yours." Grace took it calmly. He hesitated. "I don't expect forgiveness." "You won't get it," she replied softly. He nodded. "But thank you." She studied him one last time. "I hope you learn from this." Daniel gave a faint, broken smile. Pain is a very expensive teacher. He turned and walked away. This time, not in arrogance, not in anger, but in understanding. Grace locked the door behind him. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. The salt had burned, it had exposed, it had wounded, but it had also purified. Grace walked to the balcony and breathed in the night air. She was no longer someone's wife, no longer someone's shadow, no longer someone betrayed. She was something else now, stronger, wiser, untouchable. Yet somewhere deep in the shadows of the city, Vanessa stared at her phone, a message half-typed, unsure whether to send it, because even when enemies survive the same fire, sometimes one of them isn't done yet. Vanessa stared at the message on her screen for the 10th time. 2. Grace Okafor. Her fingers hovered, then she pressed send. Grace was reviewing a new expansion proposal when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but instinct told her not to. She opened the message. "We need to talk. Not about Daniel, about what's coming next." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she called Barrister Kunle. "Is there something I should know?" She asked calmly. Kunle hesitated. "There are rumors," he admitted. "A civil lawsuit may be filed." "By whom?" "Minority investors who suffered stock losses during the scandal." Grace closed her eyes briefly. The fire wasn't finished. It was spreading in new directions. Across town, Daniel sat in his small apartment, scrolling through headlines that still carried his name. He had paid fines, signed confessions, lost status, but public memory is slow to forgive. His phone rang. It was Mr. Ibrahim. "There's a problem," Ibrahim said bluntly. "Some investors are planning to drag Grace into court. They claim she should have known." Daniel sat upright. She didn't know. Perception doesn't care about truth. Daniel ended the call and stared at the wall. For the first time since everything began, he felt something pure. Not resentment, not pride, but responsibility. The next day, Grace agreed to meet Vanessa. Not in her home, not in a luxury hotel, but in a quiet, neutral cafe. Vanessa arrived first. No silk, no gold, just simplicity. When Grace walked in, heads turned slightly, not out of scandal now, but quiet recognition. Grace sat down calmly. "You said something is coming," she began. Vanessa nodded. "There are investors preparing a lawsuit. They think you were involved." "I'm aware," Vanessa swallowed. "They're also considering using personal angles." Grace's gaze sharpened. "What personal angles?" Vanessa hesitated. "Your miscarriages." The words hit like a slap. Grace's face didn't crumble, but something behind her eyes flickered. "They want to argue emotional instability influenced corporate oversight," Vanessa continued softly. For a long moment, Grace said nothing. The cruelty of it. The desperation. Using her private pain as public ammunition. "Why tell me this?" Grace finally asked. Vanessa looked down at her hands. "Because I know what it feels like to be destroyed publicly." Grace studied her carefully. "Are you asking for forgiveness?" "No." "Redemption?" "No." Vanessa met her eyes. "Just balance." Silence stretched between them. Two women once positioned as enemies, now both scarred by the same man's downfall. That evening, Grace stood alone in her bedroom, the same bedroom where Daniel once said the soup tasted like tears. She touched her stomach lightly. The memory of loss never truly disappears, it just becomes quieter. But now strangers wanted to weaponize it. Her phone rang. "Daniel," she answered. "I heard," he said quietly. Grace didn't ask how. "I won't let them drag you into this," he continued. "You don't control them anymore." "No," he admitted, "but I can speak." Grace was silent. "I'll issue a statement," he said. "Clarify that you had no involvement, that any failures were mine alone." She almost laughed. "Why?" she asked, a pause. "Because this part is my fault." Grace closed her eyes. The irony was sharp. The man who once betrayed her was now trying to shield her, but trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild overnight. "It won't erase what happened," she said. "I know." The lawsuit was filed a week later. Media storm returned, but this time the narrative shifted. Daniel held a press briefing voluntarily. He stood under flashing lights once again. "Mrs. Grace Okafor had no operational involvement in the mismanagement," he said firmly. "All executive decisions were mine." Reporters pressed harder. "What about allegations regarding emotional instability?" Daniel's expression hardened. "That line of attack is disgraceful," he said sharply. "Personal tragedy has no place in corporate blame." Grace watched from her office. For the first time in months, Daniel looked honest, not powerful, not charming, just accountable. Court proceedings were tense, but evidence supported Grace's distance from daily executive transactions. The attempt to weaponize her personal pain backfired publicly. Sympathy shifted toward her. The lawsuit weakened, eventually dismissed. After the ruling, Grace walked out of the courthouse quietly. No triumphant speech this time, no viral statement, just dignity. Daniel stood at a distance. He didn't approach her immediately. When he finally did, his voice was calm. "It's over," Grace nodded. "Yes." A long pause. "I never wanted you hurt," he said softly. Grace looked at him steadily. What did you learn from this story of Grace and Daniel? Drop her comment, like, share, and please subscribe. Tell us what kind of story you want next. Stay blessed.